Welcome, everyone. We're going to allow people to get in through the door and get into the webinar room, and we will get started in just a moment. Thank you for joining us today. We will get started in just a moment. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the webinar by NADTC and AARP called More Mobility, Stronger Connections Using Transactional Data Specifications, Part 1. So today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a welcome. We have our presenters, Diane Schwager and Jana Leinot, who are joining us, and I will introduce in a moment. Some logistics for the day. All participants are muted. The session is being recorded. It will be sent via email along with an evaluation and the slides. It is also going to be on our website at NADTC, our website at this link. Closed captioning is available. You can turn the captioning on and off by clicking the CC button at the bottom to show or to hide subtitles. And in the chat, will be if you prefer the streaming text, that link is being put in the chat for you. Please enter your questions through the Q&A box. That allows us to keep better track of the questions. The chat function is open if you have anything for us individually, or you're having some issues, and you can certainly use that, but we would request that if you can, please put your questions in the Q&A box. So a little bit about the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. We are a federally Transit Administration funded technical assistance center, and our mission is to promote the availability of accessible transportation options that serve the needs of older adults, people with disabilities, caregivers, and communities. We do a variety of activities. We have person-centered technical assistance and information, so you can contact us for technical assistance. We provide a variety of training opportunities, most of it online at this point. We have an e-news, and I'd recommend that you sign up for our e-news. It comes out monthly and is packed with information, resources, upcoming events. We do a lot with coordination and partnership, and we have investments in community solutions, which are in the form of community grants. We are finalizing our grants from last year right now, and you can just look out for that opportunity as we anticipate one coming up later in this year. So I'm very pleased to welcome Diane Schwager. She is the Senior Program Officer of the Cooperative Research Program for the Transportation Research Board. Diane managed the project of Transactional Data Specifications, and the report of that was published in 2020. I'd like to welcome Diane, and you can go ahead and take over the presentation.
Thank you, Carrie. Could you move to the next? Okay, great. Thank you. So my name is Diane Schwager, and I, as Carrie said, I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Transit Cooperative Research Program. And in that capacity, it's my responsibility to manage TCRP research projects. What this means is that I work with a panel for each project that's comprised of knowledgeable and interested people who define the project and monitor the research as it progresses and reviews the draft and final deliverables. And the panel is made up of people that are experts and typically the end users of completed research. I also work with a research team for each project that's selected through a competitive procurement to carry out the project. So the Transit Cooperative Research Program is part of the Transportation Research Board, which is part of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which is a private nonprofit organization. It is not part of the federal government. The National Academies was formed by Abraham Lincoln over 150 years ago to provide scientific and technical advice to the government, which is what we continue doing to this day. Next. So TCRP conducts applied research. And what this is it's problem-solving research, in this case for the public transportation industry. And it's one of several modal groups that TRB has that address similar types of issues. And the others include highway, airports, and passenger rail. Our projects address the day-to-day problems that are faced by practitioners in virtually any area you can think of. Next. So for today's presentation, I've pulled together a small sample of reports that are likely to be useful to the participants in this webinar. This slide lists several recently completed reports that address how to provide services that people want to use. Next. This next slide includes some recent reports that TCRP has completed on topics designed to help transit providers improve their business and management practices. And there are many more that address topics that I know are of interest to you, such as improving access to dialysis, non-emergency medical transportation services, mobility for veterans and their families, and many, many more. Next. So this next slide focuses on new systems and technology. And the title that I've highlighted is TCRP 210 on transactional data specifications, which is the focus of today's webinar. And as Carrie mentioned, this report was completed actually in late 2019 and was published in 2020. And you have a link to this report through this webinar. Okay, next. So let me start with the objective of this project, which was to develop transactional specifications technical specifications for transactional data. It's sort of a big mouthful. So what did we want to do with this project? We wanted to develop practical methods and tools to improve DRT performance. And in short, we wanted to develop tools and methods that would improve efficiency, which means making it cost less per trip for passengers served, to improve effectiveness, which means carrying more passengers, especially per vehicle hour, and to improve quality and therefore passenger satisfaction by reducing trip times, wait times, and overall giving passengers more and better options. Next. So what are data specifications? And more to the point, what's transactional data? A data specification is a program that helps computers talk to each other. It provides a common language that can be used by two or more computers, in fact, many computers. And by having a common language, the computers can work together and enhance collaboration. And transactional data are the different types of information that describe a passenger or a trip that are needed to plan, schedule, and deliver trips. This includes, for example, when and where a person needs to be picked up, if a passenger has a disability or travels with an aide, whether they need assistance, and if they need a return trip. And you know all of this information since you gather it for all the trips that you provide. Next. This project did not start from scratch. Rather, it built on relevant experience, methods, and technology. In particular, the research built on the airline industry, which has been using standardized data and computer technology for over 20 years that allow us to all book air travel without travel agencies. This has greatly improved customers' options, as well as efficiency and effectiveness. And Flex Denmark, which Jen Alina will be discussing in more detail, Denmark exemplifies what is possible. It has become the world leader in integrating DRT services. Flex Denmark uses transactional data specifications nationwide to integrate more than 500 public and private DRT providers with over 5,000 vehicles. And Denmark has greatly improved its DRT performance, as you'll soon see. So next. So here's my name and contact information. And I've also included the TCRP website, which you can use to learn more about other TCRP reports. So thank you, and I'll turn things over now to Jenna.
Thank you very much, Diane. So next, I'd like to welcome Jana Lina. She is the Senior Strategic Policy Advisor with the AARP Public Policy Institute. AARP recognizes the importance of demand response transportation, and Jana has been integral in their work in this area. Welcome, Jana.
Thanks so much, Carrie. And thanks so much, NADTC, for hosting these webinars and helping us get this information out about this new tool that I think can really benefit all of your services out there in the field. And I also want to give a shout out to Diane and TRB for leading this effort to develop the transactional data spec. Data standards is something that we're seeing an increasing number being developed in the transit and transportation arena. And I think it's really, really essential that we have a set for demand responsive transportation so that people, older adults, people with disabilities, rural residents, others who really depend on these types of services are going to be able to benefit from a lot of the modernization that's happening in this sector today. So I served on the panel that Diane mentioned as part of the Report 210 Transactional Data Specifications Development. And that's where I really became much more involved in trying to help promote data standards as a way to help modernize this sector. And as subsequent to that, I've done a couple of publications in this area. AARP has funded a proof of concept of the ride sheet software application, which we'll hear about on Thursday, which is very much the first implementation in the US of this data spec. And it is really intended to be a resource for small nonprofit providers. But in addition to this type of research, I also had the privilege of taking a film crew to Denmark in 2018 in order to do a study tour and document just what is it about this system that is so world renowned and can teach the United States so much. So I want to start by sharing one of our videos from Denmark.
Transportation in Denmark is all about options. Cutting-edge technology connects riders to a myriad of ways to get around. And everyone benefits, no matter what age.
Denmark is a country with 5 million residents. We are an aging population.
Danish law requires transportation services be provided to all citizens who are disabled and to those needing a ride to the hospital.
Because of the elderly population growing, these kinds of services are in high demand.
In the rural areas, where a large percentage of older Danes reside, cost-effective transportation is a necessity. Fixed bus routes on a regular schedule are far too costly to maintain.
What we've seen in many years in Denmark is there will be bus services in many rural areas. Those services are simply, over time, too expensive. Bottom line, there was a lot of air in those buses and too few bumps on the seat.
That was actually one of the starting points. How could you make good mobility services in the countryside without making bus routes? It's not about the line or the route that we're going to take you.
Okay, en aftale. Tak.
It's about you as a customer getting the mobility service at the time and at the price and at the quality you need.
One of the reasons to try and see if we could get a more both customer-friendly setup, but also a more economical setup, was to try and demand responsive service out in those regions, giving the customer a better service, but also the municipals and the regions a better use of their money. So that challenge we've tried to solve with Flex Denmark, which has been a tremendous success.
Flex Denmark is an IT company managed by the public transit authorities. It provides demand-responsive services to Denmark's 5 regions and municipalities. Here, vehicles do not follow a fixed route. Instead, they pick up and drop off riders at the requested address.
Flex Denmark makes sure that the cars are at the right place at the right time and operate in as efficient a manner as possible. Essentially a big algorithm dispatching cars.
These kinds of services are very important in order for elderly people living active lives, being able to take care of themselves for longer parts of their lives. In that sense, elderly people are not different from other people. Flex traffic can also be used by the younger generation. Living in a rural area, kids need to go to football, to the riding school, or come back home late from a friend's house, so it's good for all kinds of people.
Flex Denmark supports competition within the private sector. The platform connects more than 550 private transportation providers into this single integrated system, providing nearly 6 million trips per year.
We do not own any taxis. We tender the whole business. Private operators are doing the operations for us.
The platform accurately calculates these fares and then automatically applies them to various government cost centers for proper payment. Jens Peter Landberg and Niels Erbo have been with Flex Denmark since the beginning.
When I started together with Niels 20 years ago, we had 5 cars. Nobody believed this coordination between a lot of cars, a lot of payers, a lot of customers using the system was possible. Now we have around 1,700 cars in contract.
While Flex Denmark provides the IT to make the system work, Flex Trafik is the brand name for the 5 services offered. These include Flex Patient, Flex Handicap, Flex Municipality, Flex Route, and Flex Tour. These 5 services use the same vehicles to get riders to a variety of destinations. A customer going to a medical appointment may share a ride with someone going to the gym, to school, or to the hairdresser.
Flex Tour, that is special. They pick you up at your address and drive you where you want to go. It's not a taxi. You can meet some people who go to the hospital, and you can meet some people who go to some medical care, but you don't know who you'll travel with.
It's a story about cooperation and also about solving problems.
That's why Denmark recognizes access to transportation as a critical component of healthcare. For example, Flex Patient, funded by the government, connects riders from less populated areas to major hospitals, providing Danish citizens with access to quality care.
It is much cheaper to transport people than it is to give them a bed in the hospital for the night.
We have a lot of customers coming into the hospital. These customers, we take them with small vehicles to the bus and drive them to the central hospital in Copenhagen. There is some medical person on board, and then the small buses bring them right to their home.
AARP has been looking at the Flex Denmark model because we understand that transportation can be a huge challenge for millions here in the United States. The Danes have been especially successful because they agreed 20 years ago that they would use a common data format to share all of the trip data. It basically creates a very integrated system that opens up a lot more possibilities for convenient service. On a per trip cost, it's really no more than what we're spending here. If we apply this technology, we're going to see a great improvement in what we have to offer here in the US.
It's transportation from your own door, and that is very important.
It works every day. It's a lovely way to be transported.
Okay. So now I will share my screen and get this presentation portion set up. It takes me just a second. So do folks see the presentation slide?
Looks good, thank you.
Great. So that was a little introduction to Flex Denmark. And I mentioned that I've been working on some other publications through the AARP Public Policy Institute. One of these is Modernizing Demand Responsive Transportation for the Age of New Mobility. And I kind of consider this the JANA version of the TCRP paper. The TCRP paper is, I think, written for a slightly more technical audience, whereas my target audience were folks from the human services transportation sector who may for the first time be hearing the word data standard and kind of scratching your heads thinking, you know, okay, what is that they're talking about and why is it important to me? And then also I mentioned that AARP funded this development of a software application ride sheet, which we'll be hearing about on Thursday, but that we also have a publication on that as well. So all of this seems really kind of wonky, but in actuality, it is so pertinent to everything that you're doing and pertinent to so much of the work that folks in this sector have been working on for the past number of years in terms of trying to coordinate these types of services, the work that we've done in mobility management, et cetera. And I really see this as a tremendous opportunity to really be able to modernize these services so that we can take advantage of all of the change that's happening in this sector. So none of this is new, at least these concepts of coordination and mobility management. And what the transactional data specifications do is that they provide the tool to really enable the implementation of what we've been trying to do in transportation coordination, as well as the tool for some of that underlying mobility management. It's also a tool that's going to enable us and enable your services to take advantage of the profound technological changes happening in the larger transportation and public transportation space. And there's a lot of energy and resources that are going toward what people are calling mobility as a service. And lots of big players involved, from large public transportation agencies to automotive companies like Ford and Toyota, to ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft. And in the eyes of many of these players, the future of transportation is going to be all about on-demand transportation and easy discovery, easy booking, easy mode transfers, and easy payment. Everything within a single system. One app, one payment, one seamless trip without the need for 24 to 48-hour advance reservations. And I think it's really time that we figure out how we're going to start offering these higher quality services within the demand responsive sector as well. Now, I coined the word universal mobility as a service, or that term, and trying to draw attention through the word universal to the need that everyone within our community be served by this new transportation ecosystem. And that's regardless of how old you are, whether you drive or you're a non-driver, whether you have a disability, whether you live in a rural area, or otherwise depend on more specialized type of transportation services. But in order to realize this vision for universal mobility as a service, we need standardized ways of sharing trip data. And that's really where the transactional data specification comes in. So even in communities where there's a strong commitment to the coordination of human services and public transportation, without this underlying technology, oftentimes staff trying to make this stuff happen is really doing this in a much more manual way. So this is kind of a typical process for coordination, where there may be a transportation coordinator in the community, a healthcare, a provider, provides that coordinator with a referral. It could be in the form of a filled out form that's in an email, and then that transportation coordinator would first determine whether the trip request falls within the service areas of their providers. The coordinator may call the patient to verify information, and then even type or rekey in this information that's on the form into their referral system in order to send that information out to the various providers in the community to see who can actually fulfill this trip. And those providers in turn maybe picking up the phone, emailing, faxing back and forth until a ride is scheduled and confirmed. And they may even have to rekey in that information into their own scheduling system. So a lot of these steps of this process to make coordination happen are still being done in a manual sort of way. Now, there are many, many benefits from doing things in a more automated fashion using data standards, such as the transactional data specification. So these are some of those. So where there is a capacity constraint of one provider in the community, another provider can step in and pick up that trip request and provide that ride without a whole lot of staff effort and sending around emails and picking up the phone, et cetera. And as a result, they can actually fill more seats and lower the cost per passenger, cost per trip, because there's more ride sharing happening. And so often in the demand responsive transportation sector, what we see is that during peak times, people's rides are being unfulfilled because there's not enough capacity, but many other times those vehicles have a lot of empty seats on them, or often the same. Those two things are happening at the same time. And technology really facilitates our ability in order to create a much more efficient system. There can be financial savings from greater efficiency and productivity. Flex Denmark has documented that they have saved they've cut the cost of delivering demand responsive transportation by around 20%, in part because of the use of a data specification. Other contributing factors are a very strong procurement process for getting these negotiated contracts with providers as well. There's less staff time dedicated to manually coordinating and scheduling trips among different providers. The information is built into the system for more accurate billing related data for trips. And that's something I think that could really appeal to Medicaid offices. CMS is always talking about the need for transparency and needing to cut down on fraud within the sector. Well, these types of systems give you the information that you need to say, I had this many miles with these people on board, this percent of the trip was a shared ride, cutting costs by this much, et cetera. So all of that information gets recorded. Now, some of you may have heard of another data specification that is quite widely used at this point in time in public transportation, and that's called the General Transit Feed Specification, or GTFS. And oftentimes when I speak to groups that are fairly new to the concept of data standards, people think that, oh, what you're talking about is the GTFS, and it's actually, these are two different specifications, the transactional data specification and the GTFS, but they're very interrelated. And what the GTFS does, it really is what allows you to get out your smartphone and look up what buses are available when on your particular route. It provides the customer with what's called discovery data or discovery information. What is the available trips that I could take? But with transactional, with demand responsive transportation, the only way that the customer can take advantage of the service that exists is through a transaction. And what the transactional data spec does is it defines the parameters for that information exchange. And it's really just as simple as that. But this image just shows kind of that flow of what information in a very simplified way of what's going on from system to system using the transactional data specification. So you can see that it supports the full trip cycle of the a demand responsive trip, from the trip reservation to scheduling that trip and performing the trip, and then even reporting and billing. So for instance, the client, who could be an individual, or it may be a healthcare provider or human service agency, they put in a trip request into the system. It could be through an electronic portal or website where the data is entered into a format that adheres to the transactional data specification, or maybe it's an information and referral line, and the individual on the other end is inputting that information into the system. But once that information is entered, and it is entered into the right format, they can also be collecting other information, pickup location, drop-off location, appointment time, what funding subsidies the customer qualifies for, and whether they have any service needs, such as they use a wheelchair or they need someone to help them in and out of the vehicle, etc. So all of that information gets collected, and then that information gets sent on to the providers in the community. And it's really those providers' software systems that are receiving that information, and it can be set up for kind of the human intervention to make the decision whether they're going to pick up the trip, or it can be in an automated system where the machine says, okay, we've got a vehicle at this time going in this direction, we're going to say yes and satisfy this trip. And so then once they accept the trip request, the provider sends that information on to the driver in the specific vehicle through an electronically generated manifest. Once that trip is completed, that information gets back to the provider, which gets, there's a flow. The schedule gets sent back to the customer, then the information upon trip completion is sent to the provider, and even all of that information about the drop-off time, odometer reading, number of passengers, etc., gets sent back to the provider as well as the funding agency for billing purposes. Now, this type of interoperability that allows two or more transportation providers in a community to essentially operate as a single network, a single provider, this interoperability can be done in a couple of different ways. The first way, which is demonstrated in this image, is what would be a proprietary application programming interface. And this is what's typical today in the United States. And it's kind of the less desirable manner of creating interoperability or interconnectivity among providers. And the reason for that is that a proprietary API system, it requires that each provider in the community, A, B, C, D providers, have to write their own proprietary API, and they have to write it in a way that accepts all the other proprietary APIs within the system. And every time a provider makes a change to their software, they need to update their API. All these other providers also need to update their software in order to accept the changes from the other persons. And so it becomes a very expensive and a very brittle process. And what often happens is you might get interoperability to function initially, but then somebody makes a change and the system goes down, or they lose one provider from the network because there's not the funding to recreate all of what used to work. I kind of consider it as an analogy as what if we dealt with 5 different outlet types or designs in order to plug in our various appliances. And right now around the world, I think there are 2 primary outlet standards, one that we use in the United States, another one that is used in Europe. And so when you travel to Europe, you have to have an adapter that you take with you. But what if appliances had to design to 5 different outlet standards, and that each time one outlet changed, they'd have to redesign all of their appliances to fit that. So it becomes a very, very inefficient way of keeping things working in sync. Now, the much more cost-effective approach is to use what would be considered an open, universal API. And the transactional data specification is just that. So when one provider makes a change to its software, provided that their software has been designed to adhere to the transactional data specification, they make one change that also adheres to that format, then the other providers in the network don't have to do anything to their software. So it's much more streamlined and much easier to keep moving forward with interoperability over time. But there are, of course, some initial costs associated with taking those software systems that individual providers use for ride scheduling and getting them to adhere to the specification in the first place. But the advantages of doing that, again, we can look back to Flex Denmark and just see what is possible when you start building a system on a universal open API or a data standard of this nature. So just some of the other points that the video didn't cover. Flex Denmark allows people to schedule rides just 2 hours in advance. They have a 95% on-time performance record, which they define as the vehicle never arriving before the scheduled time and within 15 minutes after the scheduled time. They serve almost 6 million trips a year, about 15,000 individual trips on an average day. Their peak day is actually a Danish holiday at 24,000 trips. And they have more than 250,000 returning customers every year. And their portal is used by hospitals, medical offices, human service agencies to connect clients to transportation. So it's a single portal, and all these different entities can use that in order to make trip requests. And the way it's set up is that the information they're inputting is already getting input into that standard format, which facilitates that quick electronic sharing of trip data. There's also a very, very high level of institutional coordination. It is a nationwide system. Flex Denmark is owned by the 5 public transit authorities in the country. And as was mentioned in the video, they don't actually own, the public sector does not own any of their vehicles. They contract out all of this service to more than 550 unique private transportation providers. And the reason that opens up opportunity for private businesses is that it enables even the smallest providers to compete for some of that contracted service with much larger companies. So as long as they agree to have the software that adheres to their SUDI standard, then they can be bid to become a provider within that network. And it's certainly to the benefit of the Flex Denmark company, publicly owned company, that they have as many providers as possible, because that helps to lower the overall cost by having that competition. And then also a very important part is that that cost allocation is built right into the system, that it's, again, tracking that data that's necessary for accurate billing to the various entities that are involved in funding this form of transportation. And all of this, of course, is possible because of the data specifications or data standard that they use in Denmark. So where does this leave us? I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks listening in on this webinar who may be running fairly small transportation operations that serve older adults, people with disabilities, others, and from rural areas, demand responsive services that really could help to promote this technology in a more widespread way in the United States. So certainly, as you are looking at any technology upgrades, purchasing of technology, that is an excellent opportunity to write this standard into those requirements, the use of the transactional data specifications. I think there's an increasing opportunity to do pilots, and I really, if this is something you're able to do, I highly encourage you to become part of a community that is documenting lessons learned and sharing these experiences with others. And there's lots of opportunity for that through NADTC, the other technical assistance centers, as well as a working group that AARP has formed with the Shared Use Mobility Center, specific to the implementation of the TDS. And then also educate your funders, both government as well as foundation, on the benefits of the transactional data specification, and ask for funding for it within those grant applications that you do. And then finally, champion the benefits of the TDS to professional peers, decision makers, and elected officials. So I know that this is wonky stuff to some extent, and there's an opportunity to learn a lot more. Not possible to fully understand this in one single webinar setting. So I do invite you to visit our website at aarp.org/future of transportation, where you can find our publications on this, on universal mobility as a service, the other Flex Denmark videos, and other resources. So with that, I want to turn it back to Carrie, who's going to share some additional resources and walk us through the Q&A portion of this webinar.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jana, for that. It was a great explanation of a really complicated topic, but it's something that excites me. I want it yesterday. Having come from an area and managed transportation program, this is just what some of our programs need. So there are all kinds of publications here, additional resources, the link to the TCRP report 210. These links are live in the PowerPoint, which will be available on our website, along with the recording of this presentation. And so I wanted to make sure you had these as well. And then we will go ahead and open it up for questions. So Diane joins us back in. We have several questions that we have gotten from our audience. And if you have any additional, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. So first of all, we'll start. There were a few questions, just a little more on the Flex Denmark program. Would it be correct in describing Flex Denmark as a microtransit program that integrates various providers into a single platform?
So that is a great question. I'm trying to think, microtransit, I feel, is a subset of demand responsive transportation, because when you think about demand responsive transportation, it could include microtransit, it can include taxi cab service, it could include ride hailing. One could even stretch the definition a little bit and include all of the micromobility type of stuff, but it's all of those publicly available services that don't follow a fixed route or schedule. So I feel like microtransit, it might be a little bit narrow in framing it in that sense, because what Flex Denmark does is it is more along the lines of your traditional demand responsive providers, both taxi cab companies and what would be the equivalent in our country as Medicaid non-emergency medical transportation and ADA paratransit. It kind of wraps all of those types of services together. But it also, in what could be considered more of the microtransit sense, it has opened up those services under that Flex Traffic branding to the general public and municipalities that help to further subsidize the service. And so you don't actually have to have a qualifying disability or be going to a hospital or a medical appointment to take advantage of the service. You can also just be a general citizen who wants a door-to-door ride to whatever activity that you need to get to in the community. And they have a different pricing system associated with whether or not you have a subsidy coming to you as a customer or whether you're just a general purpose rider.
Great, thank you. And that answered a couple other questions that we had about qualifiers for riding. Is this model handled through an app? What about seniors who are not familiar with apps and have no desire to learn or have limited funds to afford a smartphone? And I'll add in there broadband.
Okay, that's an excellent question. And just a little bit of more on the qualifier, the difference between discovery information that gets distributed among the different entities that are trying to get transportation or provide that transportation. You've got discovery, and then you have more of the transactional. So the customer is really primarily interacting with that discovery information, or getting information once the trip has been transacted, kind of communicated back to them. So the actual transactional data specification, it's that code that those behind the scenes computer systems are using to share that trip information in order to deliver that transportation for the individual. So what the interface with the customer is almost separate. It can be structured in a number of different ways. So certainly with Flex Denmark and the other systems where we're seeing this start to happen, you may have an online portal that just the average person wanting a ride can use, a website, or even a human service agency to schedule a trip. It could also be designed to have an app to go along with that so that you wouldn't be tied down to your computer. You could get that information on your smartphone. But that's somewhat separate of a system from the transactional data specification. But when you think of what are we trying to create here in these integrated systems, we need to be able to tie in multiple data standards in order to make that whole picture in every aspect of the trip happen. And so the transactional piece is just one piece. You're going to have the discovery piece for trip planning purposes for the individual. You're also going to have a more fleshed out payment piece to enable people to use a credit card to pay for that trip or get their subsidy processed, et cetera. So these are pieces of an overall bigger system, if that helps explain that more.
It does, because we had somebody ask about if TDS also covers that customer facing transaction, including payment. And you're saying, no, not necessarily. It's a piece of the whole system, but not part of the TDS.
Yeah, at this point, the transactional data spec captures a lot of that information that is going to be necessary for the payment side of things, but it doesn't actually have the code set up at this point in time, I don't think, for the receiving that credit card information or whatnot. So more needs to be done on that. And that's actually, there are, numerous efforts, certainly on the proprietary side of specs, trying to put some of that payment side of things together. And that's certainly an emphasis area of the Federal Transit Administration, is how are we going to set up these integrated systems that allow for payment through a single system. It's kind of that mobility as a service concept as well, but it's different pieces of the pie.
Another question, how has fixed route ridership changed in Denmark with the introduction of Flex Denmark?
That's an awesome question. So obviously, I think everyone knows that Denmark is very committed to public transportation services and just good quality access to healthcare, et cetera. I mentioned that the option for the general purpose customer who doesn't have a qualifying disability or medical trip need, they qualify to use the service if their municipality provides a subsidy to Flex Denmark to fund their use of it. And not all municipalities do. And in fact, Copenhagen, Denmark's largest city, they do not allow the general public to use Flex Denmark and the demand responsive service because they want to encourage people to use fixed route public transportation. They feel like they have a very, very strong public transportation network and that it's not necessary for people to get door-to-door service for all types of trips. But they do, by federal law, have to provide transportation through demand responsive service if that's what the customer needs on Flex Denmark.
Thank you. So in a system like that, where what entity is ultimately liable in the event of an accident in a system like Flex Denmark?
Oh, that's a really great question. I don't know that I inquired about that, so I don't want to say and and say it wrong.
Okay. Sure, sure.
But I will say, just for some other information that I do have on the contracts that Flex Denmark sets up with all of these 550 transportation providers that are part of their network, they have very, very stringent performance criteria for service in terms of delivering this on-time performance. In they have to be in adherence to the data standard. There's quite a lot, and in fact, in my paper, there's I think a 6-page write-up on Flex Denmark, a little semi-chapter within the overall paper that goes into a bit more detail about what it is they're requiring out of the performance with each of these companies.
Thank you. So in the Flex Denmark, there are private providers who get assigned the trips or get to accept the trip. How does the provider get selected to provide the trip? What if 2 providers want the same trip? How is that sorted out?
Right. So built within the algorithm of the actual system, which is built into that SUDI standard, they have set it up so that they have a cadre of providers that have, as part of their contract negotiations, said, we will, during all periods, all periods of the day, have, I think they run service 18 hours of the 24-hour day to customers. And they have a certain subset of their providers that say, we will have this many drivers and this many vehicles available to you at all times. And Flex Denmark says, well, for the price of being willing to always have something available, we'll pay you X. And then they have their fallback providers. And whenever a vehicle comes online in the morning or in midday, whenever they're online, they show up within that system. And so the algorithm is constantly electronically looking out there and identifying which vehicle can most efficiently provide this route. But they're going to favor the ones they have already negotiated a higher price to provide, be on demand at all times, if that makes any sense. And so it's built in electronically, and it's very much real time. And then, on an annual basis, they actually redo the procurement with all of these different providers, and each provider comes back in and makes an offer for what they're able to provide for the price and what availability that they're committing to within the system.
Thank you, Jenna. Question for Diane. So Diane, how was this report initiated? Did somebody bring this idea? How are reports brought to TRB, and how does someone, I have a great idea for a report, do I submit that someplace? How does that process work to get to that point?
Well, Carrie, thank you for that question. So the Transit Cooperative Research Program is very much driven by the people who want the research answers. And it's very much of a bottom-up research program. And as I mentioned, it's applied research, meaning it's this problem solving, and it's geared towards the end user of the research. Like the people that have a problem are the people we want to hear from every year to identify what their problems are, and therefore they can be the basis of new research. So every year, starting in January, TCRP has a solicitation for new research problems. And problems can be submitted. There's a fairly simple problem statement, that format that we've developed. In fact, each of those modal programs I mentioned, highway, air, transit, rail, we all have similar programs. And from December to June, TCRP accepts new problem statements. So if you go on our website, you can see this problem statement submittal form. And if you can't find it, you have my email address and my phone number. You can call me and I'll help you to locate it. So you fill that out, you submit it, and then every year in the fall of the year, our board, which we call our TOPS committee, which stands for TCRP Oversight and Project Selection Committee, they select the new projects that are enough projects to spend out all our budget. And so every year we have a new group of projects. Then for those of you who attend TCRP annual meeting, we often promote our new problems there, where we invite people to serve on panels. Just like Jana served on this panel, we look for volunteers, people who know something about the problem, care about it, want the answers. And we get people submit applications to serve on a panel, and we select about a dozen people for each panel. And we're looking for people from all over the country, men, women. We want diversity in every way you can think of, geographic, racial, ethnic. We've been about diversity and inclusion long before they become buzzwords. And so each year we form new panels for each new project, and we launch a project, writing an RFP, selecting a contractor, getting it underway. And how long it takes to finish the project really depends in part or in large measure on the budget. So every year we're finishing projects, starting projects, and in the middle of other projects. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Diane. So does Flex Denmark or programs that use TDS, could they incorporate a volunteer driver program as a service provider?
Yes, they certainly could. And in fact, we'll learn Thursday's webinar that one of the providers that is using RideSheet is their transportation is provided all by volunteer drivers. So it's any scheduling system that is more than pencil and paper. So if you schedule volunteer drivers with spreadsheets, then RideSheet might be a good application for you of the transactional data specification. But let's say you're a provider out there in rural America with 50 vehicles, and you're using Route Match or Trapeze. Route Match or Trapeze could write their code for your scheduling software and adhere to the transactional data specification, and then the equivalent volunteer transportation provider that's using RideSheet, those two providers could interact and actually exchange trip information and share customers, riders, et cetera, et cetera. So it all can come together through data standards.
Thank you. So I've been holding a question that a number of people have submitted. Is there a US-based pilot? And how do you get the buy-in for doing something like this? And I left this to the end, and I see Heather has put the registration for our webinar on Thursday. Any comments on that?
Sure. So RideSheet is the first actual implementation of the transactional data spec. The TDS, it's a US-based data specification. It is modeled after Flex Denmark's SUDI standard, but it's a much simplified version of what they're using in Denmark. It's kind of a first shot at transactional data specs for the United States, and it certainly has much room to grow and build upon. But in terms of other places that are looking at this, the Atlanta Regional Commission and another nonprofit in the Atlanta region have a Administration for Community Living Transportation Planning for All grant, where they will be interoperating two provider services, a public transit agency and a small nonprofit provider, using the transactional data spec. They're at the early stages of scoping out that project. And then the Minnesota Department of Transportation, their transit agency, transit program, they are working on a regional mobility as a service statewide for the greater Minnesota transit providers that run demand responsive service in rural areas, as well as bringing in some of the other demand responsive private transportation providers. And they have committed to requiring that the technology developed for that or used for that project integrate the transactional data spec. So it's in the initial stages. We are certainly looking for more places that are willing to pilot this out and continue to help us develop this and try to promote it. And so would love to talk to anybody who thinks they may have some of that institutional stuff in place to make it happen.
Thank you very much. So we've come to the end of our time. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Jana, for your presentations today and sharing your knowledge with the group. More on Thursday. We get into the pilot program and the ride sheets, and we'll meet the two very small agencies who took this pilot on. In the chat, there is a link to the feedback form, the evaluation, if you could take a moment to click on that. We will be emailing the information out to you, but it is also on the nadtc.org website. So thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you on Thursday. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.